And I want to say thank you all very much, everybody who's here in person, and also to those of you online for attending. We're really looking forward to a great discussion. So Michael is going to speak for about 40 minutes and will be followed by a response from Yacob, which will be kind of 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor to questions. So please do keep them kind of stored. And if you're listening online, please use the Q&A session and I will try and address as many of your questions as possible. So Michael, over to you.
Julia. So thank all of you for coming, for attending. This is a report, obviously, that got a certain amount of media coverage yesterday. And what I'm hoping to do is to say something about the content and a bit about the process. Now, I should say that most of the slides I'm presenting are IPCC branded slides. And in the day after publication, I am essentially speaking as an IPCC author, which means that there are things I can say and there are things I can't say about the whole process of how we got here. And a lot of that doesn't matter, but some of it is actually very interesting. And there are things I want to say just at the general level about how the IPCC works, just very briefly for those not familiar. There's a bit of background for why does this thing matter so much and get such attention. Well, one is by scale. So the mitigation report had 278 authors across 65 countries. You can see there the balance of developing and developed countries broadly, and also the gender ratio, which is less than ideal. We assessed more than 18,000 scientific papers, and in total, 59,212 review comments. How do we know? Because everyone gets tracked. Roughly speaking, the report goes for a first order draft, gets review comments from experts, second order draft, gets review comments from experts and governments, and then a final government draft of the summary for policymakers and the supporting chapters, which gets written response from governments. And then it goes for a plenary, because it is only in a conference setting that there is any hope of over 100 governments and at least 40 authors on the, or about 40 authors on the summary of actually reaching agreement on what to say. Roughly speaking, I think those review comments divided about 5,000 comments on the summary in the last stage, and the rest about 20 and then 30,000 on those respective drafts. We were lucky in chapter 1, whereas I was co-leading. We had, I think a mere 5,000 comments to consider, every one of which we had to write a written response to. That does not mean we had to do what they told us to do. It meant we had to show that we had considered what they said and that we had a rationale for whether or not or how we present it. So the IPCC is an extraordinary process in which global research meets global review and with national perspectives of governments. By the way, I take it this is coming through clearly, is it? Yeah, and online. Ah, okay. Bit of noise, okay, fine, good. So what emerged from that process, as published yesterday, the report was flagged 3 years later, assuming I can count since February 2019, which feels astonishingly long ago. And I have to say, I'm looking here at Lilia Kuto, who is our chapter scientist for the first marathon process. 17 chapters. Our head of the Energy Institute, actually, Neil Strachan, just corrected me on the stairway and said it's now 2,900 pages. The technical summary, 142, that's a pretty odd word for a summary, and the policymaker summary has expanded over the last 2 weeks to be 61. So what does it say? On the fact that on my screen and your screen here, it's slightly lost the left-hand side. I don't think that will matter too much, but is there any reason for that? Do you think we can correct it? Is it clear online? Yeah. Well, it should be okay, but apologies, this is not quite the way that I put the slides together. The headline statement was, we are not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. I hope nobody will fall off their chair with surprise and horror. It's a pretty bland headline statement when you look at the global trend of emissions there. But what I actually wanted to do, and this is how I slightly weave both the formal results and observations, is also to say, even apparently the most basic scientific numbers are not neutral, even between scientists, long before we get to governments. So we could describe the same data as average annual emissions at the highest levels in human history. The increase from the previous decade is the largest ever seen. I keep moving across to you. Oh, could that be? Shall I turn my phone off? Might that help? Okay. All right. Well, I can stand back, but I'll turn the phone off anyway. Fine. So, though that by now you should be deeply depressed about the prospects for tackling climate change, let me just say a little more though. The average annual rate of growth during the past decade from 2010, slowed to 1.3% compared with over 2% a year the previous decade. If you look to the left, you might say, so what? In the 90s, it was almost stable. That's basically because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The underlying trend everywhere else was up. We can also say the average growth since 2014 was around 0.8% a year. And actually, that's more or less the same as the change in global population. So global emissions per capita stabilized. Now, those two, I should stress, are data in chapter 1. They are not in the SPM, not least because we have to be pretty clear and rigorous. And there are a lot of annual variations. And it was the choice of the data central chapter, chapter 2, to really focus on decadal average, to minimize anything being mistakenly attributed to short-term fluctuations. Personally, I think the data in chapter 1 is potentially also of interest, but of course we don't know exactly where things will go in the future. My point really is, even on the most basic scientific information, there are always choices to be made about what kind of insights you try and draw. So if you think that's tricky to get through over 100 governments in a plenary setting, if it's difficult among the scientists, to describe contributions by sector is complicated. By region, inevitably involves political choices about how you present the data. The headline statement, emissions have grown in most regions, not all, but are distributed unevenly both in the present day and cumulatively since 1850. There was a lot of background discussion about regional classification. The decision was on these 10 regions here. There's an annex which describes exactly what the coverage of those regions is. Just for clarity, in the annex, Mexico is not classified, it's classified in Latin America rather than North America. So fine, but then how do you write text about that? Sorry, the sectoral complexity arises, you may think, well, that's easy. It's not. The issues about electricity attribution, the energy sector or the end use sectors. Land use, change in forestry has a lot of data uncertainties as well mapped out in chapter 2. There's an urban systems chapter, which is really interesting for the contribution of urban. Of course, that cuts across sectors, etc. So there is a figure in the technical summary on sectoral attribution, but the real challenge is around regional emissions. You could start by saying you show percent or absolute growth by region, trends by contributions, when do you start, etc., etc. There was a lot of debate about when to start such data. When we get to the text, you'll see it doesn't name specific regions. There was a lot of debate about that. This is the headline statement in the policymaker summary. and the first paragraph, which included mention of least developed countries and small island developed states because they're not part of, they cut across the regional classification. So that made sense. But we wriggled and we tried to find a way of describing the regional contributions. And it basically fell down on the fact that it's just really hard for 100 countries and more to agree on what is a fair way of describing it. Some want to point the finger at that region or the other region, or what's grown or what's come down, or how long, or per capita, or intensity, etc., etc. So in the end, the conclusion was the wording you have here, but together with the data I've just shown you, plus the data in these two charts. And on the left, you have the historical cumulative contribution, where the blue is from fossil fuel and industry emissions. The orange is land use, outlines land use is substantially more uncertain. And it doesn't include other greenhouse gases, partly because of data availability, and also because, frankly, if you're going back to 1850, how much a country emitted of methane is completely irrelevant because it's 20 years in the atmosphere. So kind of doesn't make sense. On the right hand, you have a graph which is the distribution by region of those 10 regions. Vertically is per capita, horizontally is population. The mathematicians here will well know that per capita times population, of course, means the size of the blocks is proportional to the regional contributions of emissions. And I personally find that a fascinating graph. Maybe I'm too geeky, but if you stare at it a long time, it's very rich in information about different ways of classifying who contributes what against what kind of metrics, which gases are extraordinary, is extraordinary important. Again, there are choices to be made, even presentationally, which order really does not matter scientifically, but there was a bit of debate about where it ended. Europe's a little bit of net absorption, we think, which is why that orange is below the line, but it's quite uncertain, so the order just reflects. It doesn't matter. I keep moving, don't I? I need to turn this thing around. That will solve it. Okay, that should get me to behave. That better? Thank you. Right. And that goes along with a table of some of the other indices, including production versus consumption accounting. For those of you who know, consumption accounting would be an estimate of national footprints, including embodied emissions in trade. Now, so against that sort of numerical backdrop, a few other sort of scene-setting remarks. Firstly, in how do we think about this? Well, one of the points that the report does try to bring out, or at least introduce, is while there are a lot of different ways, even aside from how you present data, there is an economic characterization broadly. It's called the biggest market failure in history. There is a book called The Perfect Moral Storm, is how to describe climate change. It's been called a super wicked problem by the social science. And there's literature on our psychological distance from climate change, also on the politics of climate change, something we don't cite in the paper, but with somebody saying, frankly, trying to understand climate mitigation without talking about politics is like talking about Star Wars without Darth Vader. That was not something that in the IPCC we were keen particularly to cite. But the underlying point is this is also unavoidably a political issue, and there is political science. That informed something that we added in, which is there are different analytic frameworks through which to try and understand this. There's broadly the aggregate economic efficiency framework. There's ethics and equity. There's innovation, transition dynamics, how complex socio-technical systems change. And there's psychology and politics. And at a pretty late stage, some governments said, oh, you need to sort of clarify what's appropriate to which kind of countries or to which kind of issues. And actually, our view was no. The point is, you need to understand all of these. And if you only rely on one, you are not understanding the problem in its full richness and complexity. And that has been one of the reasons why we have struggled to make progress. Anyway, so that was, if you like, how to think about it. Of course, we rely on the literature. The literature itself is not well integrated across those disciplines. And that inevitably leads to some sense of inconsistency between parts of the report which are basically running economic models and others which are talking about other aspects. So the headline I just skipped over one, right? About 1.5 degrees. I'm not actually going to say very much about it. I think that is well aired. Actually, it's interesting. I had an exchange briefly with a US colleague who said, oh yeah, it's really very little coverage in the US. We've seen the headline saying that IPCC says climate change is really urgent. I thought, how many times have we said that? That, believe me, is not the most interesting thing in the report. Please believe it. It's got an awful lot there. It does not take 2,900 pages to say climate change is really important and urgent. It does say a little bit more about the characterization of that urgency in terms of the trend based upon analysis of implemented policies. The implications of, I have to do this without the legend, which was not very helpful. Apologies. The trend of NDCs, nationally determined contributions, which go below that in 2030, and then pathways towards 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, as produced by an enormous family of integrated assessment models. So what comes out of that analysis is that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with limited or no overshoot, greenhouse gas emissions peak before 2025. That's not very long. It's probably, people won't have, not everyone will have read this report by the time we get close to that. They need to reduce by around 43% in average by 2030. Methane needs to drop substantially because methane has a completely disproportionate impact on whether or not we cross 1.5 degrees because it's a very potent but short-lived gas. To 2 degrees, you can't exactly relax given what I just showed you about the trend. Global emissions would need to reduce by roughly a quarter or more by 2030. So anyway, other ways of thinking about this. This is not a slide from the SPM. It's a slide from the technical summary and chapter. Partly we figured there'd be absolutely no way of negotiating this in the global context. What the chart on the right shows is per capita emissions by region plotted against Human Development Index. And it makes a couple of points, which is, generally speaking, richer regions do emit more per capita. That is no big surprise. But there is really quite a large degree of variation, even between regions at the same level of at least human development, and underpinning that, GDP is one of the inputs to the Human Development Index. On the left is a paragraph from the SPM as to about how we try and set the point that climate mitigation is irrevocably set in the context of national development priorities, sustainable development concerns, a much wider range of national concerns that countries have. And if mitigation conflicts with those other concerns, particularly for poorer countries, it's not going to get very far. So hence those dotted arrows on the graph, which tries to say, countries at lower levels of Human Development Index, their priority is going to be improving human development, but they really need to try and keep emissions low as possible as they do so, whilst the richer countries, the richer world, actually, it's hard to get much above 0.9 on a scale that only goes to 1 in terms of human development. And the priority obviously is to meet national development needs, but with radical emission reductions. So again, slightly complex slide, but I think a valuable one. And we do try to stress, the SPM tries to stress that development involves all countries. This is not a discourse just about developing countries. It's about where do rich countries go, absolutely as well. And the language that comes out of this is where are the synergies between emissions mitigation and development priorities, and where are the trade-offs? So I started by being deeply pessimistic, at least in data. What can we say of any optimism? Well, there is some things to say, definitely. This is a chart on what's happened in costs of key technologies. In some cases now, the costs have fallen dramatically. And in some cases, costs for renewables have fallen below the costs of fossil fuels. And that's particularly the three most stark cases: photovoltaics, onshore wind, and batteries for electric vehicles. Okay, and it is a quite stunning change even from the IPCC's last assessment. And I think in our very early stages, there were quite a few researchers in other disciplines who hadn't quite believed this, hadn't quite, and I think it's quite a shock to people who don't work in the field. It's becoming more commonplace. Along with that, roughly exponential growth in those technologies. There's still relatively small wind and solar together, 8% of global electricity supply. But if you're at 8% and you pursue exponential growth, you can do the maths, even if our brains are not very good at actually understanding exponential growth. It's worth taking a little spreadsheet and seeing where that could get us, even in the decade. So, as I said, describing contribution by sectors complex. Oh, sorry, that was not the intended title. Not quite sure what happened there. The other aspect, or another aspect, is around countries. There was a brief reference, countries with sustained emission reductions. I'll add a little bit of a tail here, if I may, just to give you a flavor of these processes. And I hope, I'm looking at our chair here in case I'm getting too long and boring, right? But I think it's kind of interesting, both substantively and this kind of process. So B3.5 in the summary for policymakers has the statement there. At least 18 countries have sustained production-based and consumption-based greenhouse gases, consumption-based CO2, because we don't have data on consumption footprints for overall GHGs. And it was linked to various things going on in those countries. Some have actually reduced emissions by a third or more and several years of consecutive reduction, around 4% a year. Now, of course, that several years is kind of ambiguous, but it says, well, it's less than the 10 years above. Obviously, that's not been enough to offset global emissions growth. Fine, no issue, no problem. Though I can say a little bit. The interesting thing is a few paragraphs later, you find the Kyoto Protocol led to reduced emissions in some countries and was instrumental in building the national and international capacity for reporting. Who here is familiar with the Kyoto Protocol or have heard of it? It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it was the treaty adopted in 1997 that set legally binding emission caps on industrialized countries. And so here we have at least 18 countries that had Kyoto targets for the first of commitment period, have sustained absolute emission reductions for at least a decade from 2005. Any reasonable reader would sort of assume those were the same 18 countries. Well, they mostly are, but not quite. Roughly speaking, the original draft of that first para actually had a specific number that was significantly bigger than 18. And there were two problems with that, one of which was quite a few government review comments said, well, it'd just be nice to know what were these countries, please list them. And we thought, oh my God, no, that's not a good idea because it depends the timescale, the gas, lots of other aspects will affect exactly which countries are you counting. So it'd be thoroughly irresponsible to say, oh, the number's this and it was these countries. And the other comment was, please check as wide a range of literature as possible. And so we went away and hunted, and the lowest we could find in recent literature was 18. and that was CO2 from 2005. And the funny thing was that paragraph was adopted, and then only later did I, because I was involved in this, as you will gather, did I realize that B5 was also having a statement about countries reducing emissions. And so it was sort of scrambled to make sure, were these actually consistent, referring to the same thing? And then on Sunday morning at 5 o'clock, I got woken up by a phone call to say, governments have got a question about, who's in and who's out of these 18 countries. And it wasn't because we sort of misread it. We thought it was a lot of countries wanted to say, oh, don't we look good? It was actually, were we listing a lot of former Soviet countries whose emissions had collapsed and it was nothing to do with climate change? So fortunately, I could scramble to the said paper and check exactly and say, no, 2 of them were, quote, economies in transition under the formal use of the term. But, that's kind of life. These processes throw up things, and often governments will see clarifications, entirely legitimate and sometimes quite important clarifications that one may not have quite missed. So anyway, I won't say more about that. But I think what all this does underline is what I see in this report, and indeed the whole tone of discussions amongst the authors of the glass. Is this all doom and disaster, or is it kind of glass half full, half empty? I think that is actually probably not a scientific question. It probably reflects my character, that I tend to be a bit of an optimist, and I kind of think the glass is kind of at least filling up pretty well. There is a whole table in the technical summary which maps out signs of progress and continuing challenges. And if you want an informed debate about that question, half full or half empty, just read that table. I think it's a great piece of work. It covers 3 metrics of emission trends, 6 on sectoral trends, 4 on policies and investment. There is a lot going on, but of course it's not remotely added up to all we need, let alone if we look ahead to the basic scientific fact that the temperature will only stabilize when we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions. We can, for various reasons, reach and probably will reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions somewhat later. I've just realized, I think, oh no, sorry, on the right is the 2 degrees, the 2 degrees. Greenhouse gases you reach somewhat later. And if you get to net zero greenhouse gases, the temperature does start to slowly decline, partly because it involves negative CO2 emissions. But I'm not going to dwell on the long scientific complex debate about global scenarios. Almost half of the entire summary for policymakers is taken by the combination of scenario description with an enormous number of footnotes. Why? Because government sensibly asked a lot of questions about precisely what was this, exactly what was that, please clarify. And I think people often get an overly negative view about the role of governments in this process. A lot of them ask a lot of legitimate questions of things that need to be clarified. Of course they have national interests. If they see statistics that make them look bad, or things they find hard to believe or are uncomfortable, they will push back. But often they are just honestly seeking some real clarification. There are, of course, many other aspects to it. One thing actually just en passant that makes the presentation of regional data harder is an underlying political debate way beyond climate change about whether one can classify developed and developing countries. That is a visceral issue in international politics. There's no question the Paris Agreement does talk about developed and developing countries. Our SPM talks about developed and developing countries. But there is no political resolution as to whether it is possible today to list what is a developed and what is a developing country. And that actually was in some areas, a significant constraint on what could be presented in relation to any statistical issue. because countries really wanted to see things described with those labels or not. So the SPM has almost half of it with lots of really interesting technical material that I'm going to skip right over. I am very sorry. We would be here for a very long time. There's a tremendous amount on scenarios. There's also a lot of good material on the sectoral contributions. I was kind of tempted, but we would have been here for too long. So please see the IPCC press launch yesterday to see somebody talking about all of these sectoral slides with far more authority and knowledge than I have, including the CDR, though I suspect people seem to think that's the most exciting bit or controversial bit of the report. So, I mean, it's not, I mean, I could talk about the energy sector till the cows come home, but I think that would not be the best use of time. I do think the press presentation yesterday on the IPCC website did a great job of synthesizing down that material. So please look at that. What I do want to flag is some of the maybe slightly more technical issues at a cross-sectoral level in terms of costs, actions, and benefits, and then I'll hope to draw to a close. You can kind of tell the slides that I've helped to put together rather than the proper PR people, because they would never put this in front of a serious outreach audience. Even the author, the lead author of the figure on the right said, yeah, it's not possible to use it in a PowerPoint presentation because nobody can read anything. I thought I would actually stick it on the right-hand side because there's a couple of points that I want to say about this issue of costs and potentials. It resulted in the SPM statements on the left. Mitigation options which cost less than $100 per ton of CO2 or less could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by at least half the 2019 level by 2030. And half of that potential actually costs less than 20. Now that is really cheap. If you actually want one metric, which also relates to the top two bars on the figure, which are respectively wind energy and solar energy, 10 years ago, a lot of governments and an awful lot of economists said Germany has gone completely mad deploying all this solar energy. Is not an IPCC comment. I hope this is very clear. Because it cost $500 per ton of CO2 to use solar energy to cut emissions. Here we are 10 years later, and the blue bar at the top of that diagram is, quote, costs are lower than the reference case. You can imagine how many hours went into negotiating that way of saying, well, on average at the global level, it appears to be substantially cheaper than fossil fuels on a life cycle cost basis, on certain assumptions about fossil fuel prices, discount rates, etc., etc. Now, I must admit, I was a slight skeptic about the idea of trying to do this graph at the beginning because I'm not a huge fan of marginal abatement costs, which in a sense this is, because they are kind of static. But I do think where it's landed is very interesting. And without going into the detail, those are just the 6 different sectors that we covered and grouped. And the message of this slide is you need to do quite a lot, or rather, there is quite a lot that can be done across all those 6 sectors. And we do have plausible estimates of their likely costs over the next decade. They won't turn out to be completely right. But also, if you think about the solar story, the cost tumbled down, but we're still only at a few % of global contribution. These are not going to, something which is currently very expensive may turn out to be cheaper by 2030, but it won't have had much impact on the global emissions picture. So I kind of, I take my hat off to the people who pursued this. I thought it would be scientifically very difficult and almost impossible to get governments to agree to it, and I'm very happy that I've been proved wrong. Now, another Michael slide, taken though directly the wording out of the SPM. I'm not sure if I put up all the wording because in this paragraph we were vying for the prize of the longest paragraph in the entire policymaker summary. Having looked through section C, I'm not quite sure if we won it, but there was a section about the macroeconomics, and it's kind of hard. It shows a lot of tension around trying to be really precise about what we can say. But there was agreement that the aggregate effects of climate change mitigation on global GDP are small compared to projected global growth. And you may think this is long. This is with some phrases removed that weren't particularly central just to fit on the slide, but read the full paragraph. Along with that went the paragraph that followed, which was effectively about the global cost benefit of action on climate change. And there I put, sorry, both bolds are from me, not in the SPM. I just thought putting so many words on a screen was unmanageable unless I kind of drew your attention to sort of the bottom line. The bottom line on the right-hand side is that models that do incorporate economic damages from climate change, unlike the ones on the left, which don't, find that the global cost of limiting warming to 2 degrees over the century is lower than the global economic benefits of reducing warming, unless, and then it sets out the kind of assumptions that have to be made to come up with a different conclusion. Why do I bother to say this? I think many may think it's a bit of a weird way. Any well-trained economist would want to know, what does the cost benefit look like? The US Congress has a legal requirement to assess the costs and benefits of any policy. And I think it's quite useful the IPCC was able to say something about it, albeit with very appropriate caveats. I think it's also interesting that this is the first time the IPCC has attempted to make any global cost benefit statement for 25 years. It tried in 1995 and it nearly blew up the entire IPCC because it requires lots of difficult things, including assessing the value of statistical life, how much is it worth to save lives in different parts of the world. You can imagine governments get pretty sensitive about that kind of thing. But this time there has been a statement on global cost benefits. Final area briefly, because I will draw to a close. There is extensive, there's a whole chapter on finance, fascinating chapter, very controversial chapter. You can imagine the difficulty of crafting conclusions given how hard it is to measure financial flows, what is mitigation finance, the sensitivities around developed versus developing countries, etc. What it broadly comes out and does so in the technical summary at a sector by sector level is how do the estimated investment needs stack up against where we are? And in aggregate financial flows, actually mitigation may be looking a lot cheaper than we thought, but the financial flows are not yet remotely commensurate with what's needed. That is not because we don't have enough money. It may be because governments feel they don't have enough money, but there are vast pools of private capital in the world. The problem is not shortage of global capital. It is how it's deployed, and particularly in relation to developing countries where the cost of capital is much higher. I won't dwell on that further, but there's just lots in there. So what actually at the policy end can we say, have we managed to say and conclude? Very much there is a whole range of policies, regulatory policies, economic instruments that have proven to be effective in reducing emissions. There was a clear consensus that policy packages and economy-wide packages are the key to achieving systemic change. There is no single magic bullet in policy. There is not even a most efficient policy. It is how different policies combine in various ways. And some of you will know that that's an area of research that I and some colleagues have been much involved in. And there's, I think, some really interesting material in the technical summary of that. But of course, that requires adequate coordination across governments and wider society. Technology is part of the policy package. It is not something which will fall like manna from heaven to make this job a lot easier. It required some heavy policy lifting to get the revolutions we've seen in renewable energy. So investment in policies push forward innovation, push forward lower emissions technology innovation. Decision-making requires not just, we can't do a cost-benefit analysis on some of this stuff. You don't know unless you try it. And you may have to try quite hard and for quite a while. But there are a whole range of options, technically viable, rapidly becoming more cost-effective, which do have public support, but others face all kinds of barriers. And one of the new contributions, I think, in this report is starting to disentangle what kinds of technologies can we expect substantial learning and cost reductions, and where is it going to be a lot harder to achieve them. And there's the global issue about differential adoption. So final remarks, and this is perhaps an area that I hope Yacob will pick up or perhaps criticize me for not saying enough about, but he is better qualified than I to really put a bit of flesh on the bones of the general comment that I made, which is climate mitigation will be set in the context of national developmental priorities to a substantial degree as expressed through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of which climate action is but one. There are many other things that countries are striving to achieve. We do have extensive analysis, and I'm not going to go through the details, of a whole range of mitigation options, and where there are synergies with those other goals, in which case it's a plus, where there's a minus, in which case it's a trade-off, or where there's a dot, in which case it's probably either neutral or maybe insufficient data. I'm not going to go into the details, but it covers all the sectors. Some of those, both synergies and trade-offs, are actually perhaps most intense in terms of some of the land use related issues. I was interested, Jim Ski, the co-chair of IPCC, concluded the press launch yesterday with this slide. The time for action is now. One could say, right on, but it has been that for quite a while, and there has been action. The issue is the need to rapidly accelerate this. How much will the report contribute? It's really hard to say, but I was tempted, and I actually asked Harry, who's helped to organize this meeting, many thanks, if she could play a certain track, either as we came in or went out. I was told actually you couldn't do that if you live stream. It would break the copyright of the Rolling Stones, who came into my mind as saying, you may not get what you want. You may not get what you want. You can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you might just find you get what you need. I think this report is what we need. I think it really has an enormous depth of material and evidence, not just the time for action is now, but what and how it is that we can. On that note, I'd like to hand over to Yacob. Help. There we go. Whoops. No, not my mobile. Right, what do I do? Put it in my pocket. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? Thanks, Michael. I think you've pretty much covered all the ground. And what I just wanted to do was just summarize, just a few things, but perhaps even questions, that not just in the heads of the lead authors, but also in all of us in terms of what this report represents. I mean, I remember going back, maybe about 5 years or so ago, and I was having a discussion with Neil, and because we were in the same chapter in the last round. And Neil asked me a question, you're going to be in the next round. Would you be interested? And at the time I said, well, I'm not sure. It depends, or something like that. Or maybe I said, no, I don't. I'm not going to say, what you said, because you can defend yourself on that. But the chapter I was in was a new one. It was looking at demand and services.
And that, brought some new challenges, because it was, until this round, by and large, you could argue that a lot of the stuff around lifestyles and livelihoods and demand reduction and so forth was tucked away in different chapters. And so this was a real opportunity to pull all of that together into a single chapter. So that's my justification. But just to highlight something which, a number of things that Michael talked about. I think what's interesting about this particular IPCC report is how much stuff there is in it. And almost, every constituent, if you want to call it that, climate related, would have something in this report. We could sort of, I've just talked about the chapter that I represent, which is the chapter 5 on lifestyles and demand. So that in itself is quite new. Carbon dioxide removal. That's something which was, again, somewhat hidden behind models and other things in the past, or just little paragraph here and there. It began to resurface. It began to become important in the 1.5 special report. But in this report, in the 6th assessment report, it really is, turned into, it has come into the mainstream. I think, the questions around co-benefits is also something which was glossed in the past to an extent. And this time, the question around co-benefits and well-being is very much into the open. But I think also what I feel is quite important is to read the working group 3. This is the mitigation report. On its own doesn't make any sense, to me anyway, especially if you're talking about development and developing countries and livelihoods and so forth and resilience. There are, the 2 reports that precede this one, which are really important to read alongside this. So for example, questions around resilience, it does appear in this report, but it really is much stronger in the adaptation report that we've just seen approved 2 months ago or so. And the questions around system change, we talk about it here, but again, that was something which was brought to the surface in working group 2 reports. Questions around individuals and the kind of structural drivers of change. Again, that's something, so my advice would be not to read just this report, but rather to go deeper into the entire IPCC set of reports. So that would be, you'd be 1,000 pages, But there will be a synthesis report that will come quite soon. I think, Michael, you would be involved in that. No, you're not. Well, the synthesis report is one that essentially synthesizes those 3 ones. So I think, that's something to wait for. Now, just to, a few points. I think Michael talked about this developed country split. And this is something which was there, of course, in the 5th assessment report. And it generates a lot of emotion, a lot of interest, a lot of resistance, from different countries as well. And I think, that's something which we did see this time around as well. And there is no way around it. It is something, which appears. And I think, behind it is, of course, the whole question of, countries, or at the plenary, the countries come to negotiate, but they negotiate, based on their national interest. That's something, which we have to accept. So countries come with their agenda, and therefore to try and, to an extent, read the report in that light. And so I think, that's something to keep in mind. I think one other issue is that the historical emissions, is an issue which is also becoming quite prominent. Some countries raised it, to a pretty high level, much more so than in the past. and to an extent, this might also feed into working group 2, when you start talking about loss and damage and compensation, then these issues begin to make sense. The whole question around historical emissions, where do you start, 1850 or 1990, and so forth. So I think, as Michael said, the action has to be on all fronts. We've seen about, technology costs and the feasibility of costs, but also finance, access to finance. All of these questions are really, which to an extent, inform the debate around what happens beyond these IPCC reports. And of course, we know that there is also the annual, negotiations that happen in between as well. So next year, for instance, we have the COP is the climate talks will be in Africa, in Egypt, and quite a lot had been achieved, as we know, in Glasgow, and there's quite a lot that still remains to be discussed in Egypt. And I would imagine that a lot of what has appeared will be debated and discussed in Egypt. And then the other issue, of course, is the finance, the issue of de-risking. And here I'm really approaching it from someone who works in a developing country setting, where particularly when you talk about sub-Saharan Africa. I just returned recently from Malawi, and that's quite telling, where you have 18% electricity access. And really the kinds of issues that we are discussing around mitigation, even the photographs that we are using don't really represent, a country like Malawi, for example. And yet, that is the real kind of Africa in a sense. And I think, the questions around finance, now we know that we are 6 times less, where, we need 6 times more money in order to be able to meet the Paris targets, for example. So I think the cost of capital is a big issue for developing countries, and one has to really ask the question: why is it the case that the cost of capital is so expensive in Malawi, where there is a desperate need for electrification, for example? And often, and even we are perhaps guilty for it, even within the IPCC. We talk about countries need to improve their regulatory, improve their legal system, improve their policies in order to be able to attract financing. So this is always the kind of narrative that we often come across. But I think I would also like to see, what about asking the same question to private finance? We know that there is a glut of finance out there. But the issue is that, are we actually measuring, or are we actually encouraging finance to, by using, the simple question of markets and profits? Is that enough to be able to create access to finance for developing countries? So that's a question that I would like raised. We know that, for instance, you take sub-Saharan Africa, over 90% of climate finance that's coming through, which isn't a huge amount, but 90% of that is in the form of aid, in the form, money coming from donors. The equivalent amount, 90% plus, that climate finance invested in the United States comes from a domestic private sector. In Europe, it's something like 60-40 split. So what you have is very different sources of finance. And of course, what it also represents is that we know where the finance is actually going. Private finance. It's not coming to regions like Africa or South Asia. It is actually staying in Europe and North America. And then finally, just to an observation that I had was that last time around, the big story was was CCS was the big story. This is the carbon storage. This time around, it is CO2 removal through trees and perhaps using some CDM type of approaches. The issue is, since the last assessment report, how many CCS installations, how many of them do we have now? Because it was seen as part of the solution. Now the issue then is we have to ask the same question. What kind of research, what type, how long will it take for a lot of these CDRs to come into the market and begin to change the picture in terms of mitigation? How long do we have? And because at the same time, we're also talking about 7 or 8 years until we cross beyond the 1.5 degrees. So I think these are questions about timing, which are going to be quite important. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Pardon? I'm not going to run away with it.
So are there any questions? We're going to stand awkwardly at the front. Are there any questions from the audience first? There's a few questions from online, but I was wondering whether anybody here has any questions first. Paul.
Yeah, probably a question for Michael.
Michael.
CCC said cost of reaching net zero by 1% of GDP.
Yeah.
IPCC said up to about 3.7% of the global GDP, just to be 2 degrees.
Right.
Zero. So that seems to be quite disparate.
So obviously that's a global figure. I guess one thing to bear in mind is UK GDP is substantially higher than the global average per capita. That would also affect that. But also bear in mind the process does try to spell out a full range, and that's our job to acknowledge the wide range. So 2.7 is the upper end of the range for the global costs of reaching net zero, according to those global IAMs. I actually think there's a tendency that the more granular a country gets, the more options it finds that may not be fully represented in some of the global models. But there are counter arguments. A lot of those models assume that policy is broadly efficiently implemented. And of course, you could raise a question about how good governments are at implementing policies efficiently. Just maybe one other aspect, which is for all that global analysis, the IPCC could only use models which, in its actual scenario database, from researchers who had models that could do a full integrated assessment, including temperature impacts. And almost by definition, that slightly constrains how, or should we say, what kind of models you can bring to bear at the global level. So for example, there are no Keynesian type models in there because it kind of doesn't really work at the global level. And I think some of us are involved in other modeling approaches which have more emphasis upon endogenous innovation in systems. Actually, I had a quick advert. On Thursday, I'm talking at another broadcast seminar more on that angle of things as to how much what we've learned about innovation could actually change our thinking about some of these issues in terms of even potential areas by which countries can gain if they're really smart about this in economic terms as well.
We had a question online, which was, is there enough about methane in the report, given it's a much more powerful greenhouse gas and increasing more quickly than CO2? And also that the report continues to use a global warming potential time horizon of 100 years, despite net zero targets for 2050, suggesting that 20 to 30 years would be more appropriate.
It's actually a really good question. Short answer is yes, there's much more about methane in this report than previous ones. Unfortunately, the second part is a much longer thing. The difficulty that we as a scientific community have with this issue is unless you get CO2 to net zero, you will not stabilize the atmospheric temperature, will not stabilize the global temperature. And that is a long-term business. These are long-term sectors. The cumulative emissions, most of them are still there in the atmosphere. So, you know, long ago, there was an agreement to focus somewhat on, well, compare gases on the basis of a 100-year time horizon. And for quite a while, also, that seemed to sort of also show CO2 as the dominant gas. But methane concentrations have been rising by disproportionately more, I think, and that's worrying people. Data on methane is still, frankly, pretty shoddy compared with our data on fossil fuel CO2, and people are worried that there's maybe more around. And C, you're absolutely right. If you're looking at 1.5 degrees, why on earth would you use 100-year global warming potential? It misses the point entirely. Methane accounts for about 1/3 of the total warming we have observed today. Just think about that, because they've been going up so much, and there's still a lot of methane. If we could stop tomorrow, which we can't, it would all be gone within 20 years, and 1.5 would be far more feasible. If you actually look at the Working Group 1 science report, and you ask the question, how much CO2 can we emit before we get to net zero, what's known as the remaining carbon budget, the answer is quite uncertain. And most of that uncertainty is because it all depends on how much methane you think is emitted. So, but I mean, there's no easy fix for that combination of problems, right? And it's just 100 years has got cemented into the system as the default, but it is not in any way an IPCC recommendation. It is simply what's become the default metric in all the data we produce.
Another question.
What your take is on nuclear energy as the source, and why there's so much hesitation.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question for those online. And the question was about what the panel's thoughts are on nuclear energy and why there was reluctance amongst academia to consider nuclear power. Michael, I'll hand to you.
Two slightly or significantly different questions. I think probably the report is fairly mixed and muted in some ways on nuclear, but it does give some reasons why. It's got quite a lot more to say about CCS, but on both of them, I think I briefly made a remark about one thing that's new in this report is looking at where have technologies made a lot of progress and what are the characteristics of technologies that make a lot of progress. The evidence of the last couple of decades is that nuclear has not empirically fallen into that category, and we think we understand why. So, you know, that's the context, and that's about all the IPCC can sensibly say. I think you were asking, what do individuals think about nuclear? And the answer is, individual academics think about nuclear. The answer is extraordinarily diverse, and you can ask me in the reception.
Yeah, could you?
No, not much. I mean, you know, pretty much what Michael said, but I think, you know, the nuclear issue is not is also, you know, beginning to come out not just in the kind of traditional places where nuclear has been deployed, but also, I mean, I'm beginning to see it, for example, in you know, in policy documents across Africa, for example. So it is you know, I mean, issues around distributed nuclear. So I mean, there are a whole bunch of, you know, framings that are beginning to emerge. We'll see where we go with that.
I'm going to take another question from online, and this is the headline that emissions must peak by 2025 to have a chance of reaching 1.5 or 2 degrees seems a very precise number and packs up a lot of uncertainties. Could you tell us a bit more about the details behind those headlines?
With the framing chapter.
Well, The short answer is most of the statements about pathways are simply expressing the results of the scenario, either the scenario database that was collected of, I've even lost track of the number of models, but it was a scary number of models, or at least model results, or the results of what were called 5 illustrative mitigation pathways, which tried to sort of do a sort of archetypes of different ways you could deliver deep emission reductions in the Paris goals. And basically, I mean, I'm putting this in my language, right? Not IPCC language. All of the models, and this is a major difference from 10 years ago, all of the models and scenarios said below 2 degrees or 1.5. My God, we'd better get on with this. All of them start dropping emissions immediately. At a global aggregate level, with the usual assumption that somehow magically governments will all act in concert in equitable ways such that you can use GDP as the indicator of efficient action because money will flow to the poorer countries where it may be cheaper to reduce emissions but struggle more. You know, there's lots of implicit assumptions in these models. But the fact is, if you take any view of a globally cost-efficient pathways, it says you're on the wrong track. And the only reason it says 2025 is because a lot of these models run in 5-year time steps. So they basically said, well, why haven't you started already? That's basically what the models say. Why haven't you already started cutting emissions already? What was much harder to do then was, if you like, a contingent analysis of, well, what if we don't actually get declining emissions immediately or from 2025? And I think the answer to that is fairly clear in the analysis of the NDCs, which is pretty unequivocal. Again, my language, but not a million miles from the IPCC. Well, if you're after 1.5, if you haven't done better than the NDCs, forget it. It ain't gonna happen. It's just too steep. You've burnt up nearly all of the carbon budget by 2030, based on the NDCs. For 1.5, if you're talking about 1.5 by the end of the century and you're going to overshoot, well, of course, that gives you headroom. It depends on how much negative global average negative emissions you can get in the second half of the century that sucks the carbon back out to get you back down to 1.5. 2 degrees, it's a lot more complex. Broadly, what the models all say is, well, it would still be possible to just do the NDCs. You could still get to below 2 degrees, but economically it'd be a pretty dumb way of doing it because you would have to move so much faster afterwards. I do apologize, those were not IPCC words, but read the text and see the very carefully crafted language, reach your judgment whether my summary is a legitimate summary of the findings.
No, I'm good.
Okay, well, lots of questions from this side. Should we take you in the first row, second row? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Michael, many thanks. You mentioned that the report received thousands of comments from the researchers as well as the policymakers. So you need to make changes, make revision of the report following their comments. So are there any comments, are there any revisions make the reviewers happy, but make you unhappy?
Okay, so for those online, the question was, given the 50, 60,000 comments you had on the report, were there some comments that satisfied the reviewers, but not the authors? Yacob, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, what you're trying to do is, as much as possible, respond, to the question. And you have 3 options. One is to reject, in which case then you rebut that question. The other one is to agree, and and make the adjustments that were required with a thank you note. So I think there are some cases, some situations where you may not be entirely certain, but you would be willing to sort of go the distance, to try and meet the provided that it is It is within the kind of frame of logic that you have been operating with. But yeah, Michael.
No, I'd echo very much that. I mean, obviously, the best comments are the ones that say this is fantastic and you don't need to change anything. We didn't get many of those. Some were just out of court or blatant lobbying and either didn't even justify. Some were almost saying, delete this. And you had to say, why? As that's a legitimate response if people don't give a reason. But a lot of them, made you sit and think, yeah, actually, I mean, some of them would say, you haven't covered this paper, and you have to go and look at that paper and say, does it make a useful contribution? And if so, you need to cite it. And frankly, with however many papers it was, and I've lost track, it's totally impossible for us to have covered all the literature in the first draft. And quite a lot of comments thought, oh, okay, that wasn't as clear as I thought it was. Well, I work in that field, so it's not surprising. I need to explain it better or to justify it better or whatever. But, the great majority, I would say, were in the spirit of the IPCC. But as Yacob said, be realistic. You can produce a global model, a global picture of what the world should do. Governments are going to come back and say, well, what's that got to do with our circumstances in our country or our interests that this statement would threaten? You really need to justify this. And if you cannot justify it rigorously, you've got to take it out. And that is what the process is there for. One final word. 3,000 pages close on may sound like we just went on and on and on writing. You would not believe the pressure on us to try and limit the word length. You might think we failed, but.
Yeah, we had another question here. Okay, so the question was with the graph which showed emissions by different regions, that international aviation and shipping was separate. And the question was, what are the risks with keeping it separate? Does it allow national governments to not include it in their own inventories?
I was involved in that. Well, the shorter answer is you tell me how much international aviation emissions the UK emitted. It's kind of international. Right. So, and in particular, what is on that per capita versus population graph, what's the population of international shipping and aviation? Doesn't make sense, right? So, but your question is, I mean, the text attached, the captions underneath the figures are well worth reading. I mean, I think one of the problems of IPCC reports is there's so much information in there, because people press us. So the caption says, this does not include international aviation and shipping. It is a separate category on the first two panels of that figure because it wouldn't be assigned to a region, but we made it on there. And it's surprisingly small. It's actually just a couple in terms of historical contribution, aviation and shipping is about 2%, I think. But those numbers are there. In terms of policy response, you're partly asking a sort of institutional political question. So under the Kyoto Protocol, the emission targets applied to developed countries as defined there. And there was a clause about international aviation and shipping, which said they are the responsibility of ICAO and IMO to deal with. A decade later, countries were getting very impatient with the inability of ICAO to do anything serious about aviation. And the pressure did result in things that some of you may know. So I don't think they've escaped, but I think you could argue it's harder to govern an international sector effectively. But I don't think the IPCC has remotely fallen down and not shown the data where we can.
Yeah.
I guess my question is based on a takeaway that I had from the graph where it showed the marginal cost of abatement by technology sector, which is very interesting. I think a takeaway that I have from that is that basically the low-hanging apples right now are energy technologies like solar, wind, to achieve a significant abatement in the upcoming years. I was wondering if you think that that takes away a bit of attention and importance or relevance to nature-based approaches, to land use approaches, right? If you think that based on this report, there is more or less importance given to that.
Okay, here we go. So the question was about the slide with the kind of marginal abatement costs. And the question was whether that focus on energy technologies takes away from kind of land-based emissions and the potential for nature-based solutions.
It's a good question, actually. Yeah. And I do agree that there is a tendency to think in terms of technological sort of interventions rather than system-wide type of engagement. And of course, I mean, how that's going to play out is going to have, it will have, regional implications. If you're talking about solar and wind, by and large, we're talking about even the way in terms of, the costing, what you saw there, it's not really quite representative of regions where, where these technologies could be viable, technically viable, but not economically or financially viable. So I think there are going to be some of those challenges, and also land use, investments in land use and afforestation and so forth. It's going to again will have its regional dimensions, and of course if finance is going to start flowing into solar and wind and other technologies, then obviously that will have, you'll be talking about less resources flowing into other mitigation possibilities. So I would think so, yeah. Decided?
Maybe just to add, it's a place particularly where there are a lot of comments, look, how useful is this global picture if you're in a particular country in a particular set of circumstances, which will affect the economics, the potential, the options, the trade-offs, and everything around those options. So it's absolutely not a message saying, oh, look, we can do, for the next 10 years, we can do wind and solar. Not at all. And also the report emphasizes a lot of options just take a very long time to develop. So look at the chart more closely with that lens, and it says you need to do an awful lot of things across all of these sectors, or there's potential to do so.
So we had a question at the back, one over here, and then Neil. So should we take the 3 questions? And there's one more online I'd like to ask you as well. At the back, yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask if you could elaborate on the report on climate change mitigation and GDP, especially with the restrictions in the scientific on the extent which growth and climate change mitigation are framed as a trade-off.
Okay, so this question is about the potential trade-off between climate change mitigation and GDP growth. Question here. Sorry, I think that was you. Yeah.
None of the report will have obviously taken any papers that reflect what is going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. To what degree do you think that a report written in, say, 3 years' time, which takes in material from the impact of Ukraine, would change the way we need to behave and the way we need to set policy?
So this is a question about the impacts of what's happening in Ukraine, which obviously wasn't included in the IPCC. So to what extent that would change perhaps the conclusions reached? Neil, same question. There you go. Who wants to take it first? Michael?
I'll take it and then hand on to Yacob for the last word, actually, because there's a very natural hand on. So first of all, the GDP trade-off question. I was quite surprised in a way that there wasn't more pushback. But I think it's because it's an extensive review process. Governments had seen the material through the various drafts, and they weren't really in a position to dispute the numbers coming out of the models per se. what they could and did do was to ask the authors of all that to clarify what were the assumptions upon which those results were based, including, for example, the reference to, I think, global cooperation in the models, which is absolutely fundamental if you're going to have, if you like, both cost-effective and reasonably equitable pathways. I think the results themselves reflected in part the fact that a sizable chunk of the problem in at least the electricity sector now looks a hell of a lot cheaper than it did 10 years ago. And that obviously then potentially spills over into the other options like electrification of transport and so forth. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, some governments might really been surprised at first, but, you know, bear in mind, we all learn in this process, right? We learn and governments learn. And if we see something that really surprises us, or governments see something that makes them feel really uncomfortable and surprising, they will probe and they will learn, well, this is what the research seems to now indicate. On the Ukraine question, I don't really want to speculate on what a report in 3 years' time might say, and I doubt the IPCC will be asked to produce it. But we did have interesting, well, I mean, one could speculate, right, about the fossil fuel costs and gas as a transition fuel and what it's done to the politics of that. It will play out in different parts of the world in different ways, right? It may accelerate the transition in some areas. It may drive countries back to coal in others. But the interesting thing you flagged to me is we were living through COVID as we wrote this report. And that was really quite tricky to handle. And hats off to Lilia here, who actually, as our chapter scientist, trawled through what literature was being published almost as of yesterday that we could cite as we wrote what I think is actually quite an important box on COVID. And one of the things, there were many things that we could actually say about COVID on the basis of the literature. Lessons drawn, what it did to emissions, how much it appeared to change behavior, furious debates about whether it was sensible to cite being locked up as equivalent to showing that people can change behavior, right? All of that stuff. But one of the things that came out really strongly is COVID had decimated the financial position of a lot of developing countries and worsened the potential debt crisis, which makes it harder to invest, which is why I'd like Yacob to have the last word.
Okay.
That's really a central issue.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I think we don't know what will emerge. I mean, when you talk to, let's say, friends in Germany, you get even you know, fairly polarized type of responses. I mean, in some cases they would say this is the real moment, you know, to start, you know, having a real debate about energy independence through, you know, investment, further investment into renewables. Of course, the other side is arguing the same point, which is energy independence is critical. You have to use whatever energy resources you have within your borders. That could mean also coal. And I think, you know, the same type of discussions are probably will take place in various parts. And of course, along with that will emerge papers and research that will be out of which, you know, publications will emerge. I think on the issue that Michael just raised, I mean, for me, it even the COVID itself, it takes me back about, let's say, 2008. I mean, some of you may remember, you know, in 2008, around there was a discussion about, you know, we need to transition, or at the time it was a different type of language, you know, emerge, you know, take a green sort of pathway. And, you know, a lot of investment came out, but we didn't really move towards that kind of a transformation. And I think, you know, the same thing happened here as well. From a developing country point of view, from an African point of view, for example, what's galling is that, you know, we're still talking about the $100 billion, which was pledged in 2009. And yet, you know, you could see that the COVID recovery chewed up, you know, something like $18 billion, $18 trillion. Yeah, $18 trillion. Yeah. So, I mean, here is, you know, the issue of priorities and the issue of political will. And even, you know, in Glasgow and even in the discussion last week with the AR6. We're still talking about the 100 billion when it comes to developing countries. The danger with that is, and I was involved in a study, in a report which will come out quite soon from the one of the African institutions, is that the 100 billion is now just being ignored, meaning that this is not going to happen. The real cost of recovering from climate change in terms of compensation, et cetera, is much, much higher than the 100 billion. So the discussion now has moved beyond, simply because the pledges have not been honored and a sustainable, you can call it, solidarity was not constructed around the discussions that we saw over the past 10 years. So people have been waiting, out of which not real investment came out. Now the discussion is, okay, this 100 billion is just a joke. Therefore, let's try to really do a proper costing and begin to use that as part of the negotiations. So I think that's where we are.
So church bells are chiming. We're out of time. I want to hand to Michael, who wanted to say a few thank you first, but yeah, over to you, Michael.
All right, thank you very much. Well, thanks, Julia. I just wanted to say a few words of thanks first to the team here, yourself, Julia, for chairing, to Harry and the team for helping to organize this, and to all of you for coming and watching online. It's a lot of material. We have not covered it all. But also, since I think this is being more widely broadcast, just heartfelt thanks to my co-CLA, Chuck Sokoreki from Nigeria, our chapter team on chapter 1, the contributing authors, to the other 250 authors who frankly have worked very hard for 3 years to try and produce this report, but also to the team at the Technical Support Unit and the co-chairs. Managing an operation like this is a mind-bending process. I really do not know how they actually pulled it off. There are some real geniuses in there who slaved away most of all over the last few weeks, but that was just the culmination after years. And obviously to the governments as well, who generally speaking, have engaged in good faith and accepted when the author said, no, sorry, but we're right on that one. We're gonna clarify this and that, etc. It's been an intense process, but a vast effort by thousands of people. And just so huge thanks to everybody who's played a part.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Yacob. Thank you all for attending. And thank you to those of you online. I'm sorry I didn't get round to all your questions. But without that, thank you very much.